embark on the nomination of the two people who will run for the presidency of the United States. And we must not take for granted that institution of democracy. Lots of us don't really understand the exact process and the way in which we're doing it now. And so to help us, and it wasn't just for us, of course, but we have discovered a book, a report that was done by the Kennedy Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School of Government here at Harvard. It's called The Presidential Nominating System, a primer. And the director of the Institute of Politics is our guest. This is Jonathan Moore. Jonathan, you and the group of people who put this book together had a real goal in mind. What was it?
Well, it was primarily to understand how the nominating system works. Secondarily, to try and get a better idea as to what the strengths and weaknesses of the system were. And finally, to make some recommendations about how it might be improved. Since we were unable to come up with clear, strong, emphatic, remedial propositions, we published the primer as an educational effort to try and share our analytical information so that people could sort out better, know what to expect, understand better, participate better in the nominating process this year.
That's exactly why we're here. Now, the Iowa caucus is almost upon us, and I think people have some confusion about the difference between a caucus and what will happen in the New Hampshire primary. Are those the two ways in which we nominate state by state? Would you explain that?
Yes, the idea is that the parties must choose delegates for their respective national conventions at which the nominations actually take place. That's done on a state-by-state basis, and although there are lots of combinations and variations, essentially you have a caucus convention system, Iowa is an example, or a primary system, New Hampshire, Massachusetts are examples.
Well, now what's the difference there, caucus convention?
The difference is that in a primary, if I can take that first, in a state primary you have registered voters in most cases, but at any rate, voters going to the polls and voting either for a presidential preference or for delegates whom they want to send to the national convention, who are usually associated with one presidential candidate or another. So you have a day on which there is a vote of the people who are voting in on that party's side.
But excuse me, you must take a ballot either as Democrat or Republican, isn't that so?
In some states, there are open primaries instead of a closed primary, which you've just indicated, and in some states there are crossover primaries where you can take one or the other. You can't take both. The crossover primary, however, is largely being banned now in an effort to get more party discipline and more party strength into the primary system. Now, the caucus system is much more dominated and much more involved with the party machinery, the party officials, the elected officials who are members of a given party, and involve people who want to be involved from the beginning, party activists, not necessarily party officials, getting together sometimes in small groups to meet with the candidates, to test them against the issues, and to gradually at various levels, precinct, sometimes congressional district, and then up to a state convention, involve in a choice of delegates for the national convention, which does not concern a general election where people come to the polls and vote. It's much less pluralistic, much less open and participatory. You only get about 4%, 4 or 5% of eligible voters are participating in a series of caucuses.
Well, let me ask you
But you get about from 28 to 40% participating in a state primary.
When you participate in one of the caucuses, do you have to be a terribly committed, interested, political kind of person to want to go and do it, although it is open to the total public, or is it exclusive to, for example, registered voters of a party?
Different states do it different ways, but basically you can explain it best by saying it's registered voters or people who are eligible to vote who are willing to sign a pledge about the principles of the given party. So at the first level, which is usually the precinct caucus level, which is what is going to happen on the 21st of January, in Iowa, you just get people, average citizens, but who are willing to make a party identification and who want to give the time to that first set of caucusing, which is the early voting, which begins to set up the proportions of votes for the various presidential candidates, which will eventually, at the state convention level later on, translate into the delegates which go to the national convention.
Does it mean then that the only time the general public really has an input is on that very primary precinct level, and from then on the caucuses themselves keep electing delegates to move up and up and up? So it is in a sense much less reflective of public desire than the general primary that will take place, for example, in New Hampshire. Is that so?
The strength of the primary system is that it allows more openness and more participation. The strength of the caucus system is that the people who know the candidates and the issues best, that is to say, the party officials and the people who are full-time active in political and party matters, the people who are most prepared to do the negotiating and the compromising and the aggregating and the unifying of all sorts of competing political interests into a whole, into a platform, for instance. Those people get a lot more influence, a lot more action in a caucus system. So there are strengths and weaknesses of both systems.
Now I'm hearing something. You said that there were recommendations, and I want very much to hear about them. But I hear that because we have a pluralistic system, state by state by state, we do not get a national flavor that is consistent. In some states, lots of people vote. In some states, only the aficionados vote for precinct-level caucus kind of arrangement of delegates. Are we then doing the best we can as a whole country? What recommendations do you have to make the primaries more reflective of national feeling?
Well, the only real alternative, clean, different alternative to what we have now, is a national primary, where you can settle a whole thing in a single day. We think that's a very bad idea, and indeed one of our negative recommendations in this little report is that is against the national primary.
Why?
It's extremely costly. You don't get the opportunity to evolve and test a candidate over a period of time. It favors the well-known candidates. It favors the rich candidates. It does not get into regional and local issues. And it tends to further degrade and diminish the role of parties, which we think is a very important institution in the whole political process and needs to be built up and not degraded in its influence further.
Why?
Those are the disadvantages of a...
Yes, but tell me
partly
that
for the
last
reasons
one.
that I said before. We are in a situation in politics in this country when we're tending to either cop out, not vote, become alienated with the system, turn off, or express our political action, political activity in fairly parochial, narrow, single-issue, special interest respects. You need institutions, you need organizations which can create out of the fragments a whole policy or platform or candidacy which is in the national interest and is capable of defining the common national interest. In other words, we've got a lot of divisiveness and a lot of fragmentation, and we need institutions that can make the compromises, that can aggregate the differences, that can create unity and cohesiveness. Political parties is the best way we have of doing that, and therefore, if my analysis is correct, we do not want to further diminish the role of political parties by going to a primary system, which is a national primary system, excuse me, which is very media-oriented, costs a lot of money, takes place very fast, and is artificial in these respects.
You said media-oriented, and I know that you discussed in the primer the fact of television being so incredibly powerful that we have blown up the primaries and that kind of politicking at that level and the amount of money that is spent in the campaign way out of proportion. Now, how do you think we should fix that? Should we limit how much television time is given?
I think it's very difficult to fix. I think what you've got to do is to work harder on how television does its job in the political process. You've got to work harder to prevent the distorting that the media does, not only television, about certain of the primaries or the caucuses which come first, and therefore give certain candidates perhaps more of an advantage than they ought to have. We've got to make television work for us in terms of the political system as a whole, rather than let it manipulate and exploit it. The only way I know how to do that is to examine its defects and to keep the pressure on. once you've got this extraordinary medium, which carries a lot of advantages as well as certain liabilities, you can't start overregulating it, in my view. On the other hand, television does emphasize show business, personality. It's more rather than issues, rather than substance. Tends to do this anyway, and costs a lot of money. And I think that one of the reasons that the state primaries have proliferated so much over the caucuses, there were 21 caucuses in 1976. There's now only going to be about 15 in 1980. It's decreasing. Our study found that it would be healthier for the country as a whole if there was a better balance, a better mix between primaries and caucuses. There were too many primaries now. One of the reasons there are too many primaries is because of the push of television.
Meaning, that means in many, many states, some candidates become visible and actually start running for office many months before they really get nominated. Is that so?
Yes, and because the primary, the state primary is a device which accommodates itself to the needs of television, much more than the caucus convention system, which is harder to cover on that medium, even though it may be a more sophisticated and a more valuable process in terms of the political outcome. Basically, we think we've got a very screwy system of nominating the president. It is confusing, it is complex, it takes too long, it's exhausting for the candidates, it costs too much, it is too show business and personality in its emphasis instead of issues. It does diminish the role of parties. It may not even run the right tests and make the right choice of a president. But it is flexible, it is pluralistic, it has a lot of different variations which the individual parties and which the individual states want. And so our feeling is if you try to change that flexibility and that openness and that pluralism, you immediately start to get into much greater liabilities and benefits. That's why we're basically anti-reform in this area. We think that we would love to have a deproliferation of state primaries to achieve a better mix, and more states using caucuses proportionally than do now for the reasons that I've stated. But you can't legislate that from the federal government. If there was some regions of the country which wanted to experiment with a regional primary system, that's fine. We think that would add to the mix. It would teach us something about a new device, but that shouldn't be legislated from the federal government either. We don't think there should be a national primary, as I've already said. If you've got a democratic system which is open and pluralistic, don't try to fool around with it too much. Don't try to make it too rigid. Don't try to make it too quick, or you're going to get into significantly more trouble than you're already in.
And I may be too, because our time is almost up. I need to ask you one more question. Predict what will happen in the Iowa caucus.
It's very hard to do that. I think that the Iowa caucus will demonstrate to us that the caucus system, with its strong emphasis on party involvement, is extremely valuable.
Which candidates will we see emerging there?
Well, you're not going to see any of the Democratic candidates killed off in the Iowa caucus. There are only 3 of them.
You're going to see a spread.
Yeah, I mean, if there's a lot of emphasis given on, gee, who wins there and what momentum and does that give him? I don't think you're going to see either Kennedy or Carter knocked out. On the Republican side, there will be a lot of Republican candidates alive at the end of it. Some will be knocked out.
Who will fall?
Well, I think some of the lesser candidates will fall.
Who will survive?
Well, obviously Reagan is going to survive.
Reagan, Connolly, Baker.
And I would say that Connolly and Baker and Bush will all not be knocked off. I can't name the order.
Will Carter beat Kennedy in this caucus?
It's very hard to say. There's a lot of speculation about that. The competition is very tight. What's interesting about these early caucuses and primaries is not just the raw score of who wins, but what interpretation is put on it. And most of the interpretation, although there are political science interpreters and media interpreters, most of the interpretation will be done by the media. And that we all, as citizens, as participants in the political process, have got to watch very carefully, make our own interpretation, so we don't arbitrarily put someone too far into the lead or arbitrarily knock somebody off after only 1 or 2 caucuses or primaries have been held.
Well, I'm glad to say that Jonathan Moore will be back with us when it's time for the New Hampshire primary, because that, of course, is a different process, and he'll be able to both evaluate what's happened in Iowa, set us up for New Hampshire, and in the meantime, if you are interested in getting this book, The Presidential Nominating System, you can be in touch with Jonathan Moore at the Institute of Politics at Harvard, and for a small fee, you can learn lots more about the way in which we nominate our president. Thank you very much. Our next guest is the director of the Kennedy Institute of Politics here at Harvard, and this is part of an ongoing dialogue. We met about a month ago to talk about the whole primary process because your organization did a large research project on primaries and caucuses, Jonathan, and I guess right now we ought to take a look at what has been happening. Now we've gone from Iowa all the way to imminent Massachusetts. What do you see are the most significant aspects of what we are discovering as the primary process continues?
First, I think that in Iowa and in Maine and in Arkansas to a lesser degree, we learned that the caucus system, as distinct from the primary system, played a very vibrant, healthy role in the overall process of selecting our presidential nominees. A lot of participation, a lot of dialogue about issues and candidates, as distinct from just media contests and very superficial television ads.
You like the idea of the caucus where the grassroots people were talking to each other rather than a primary where there were delegate votes at stake? What is the difference?
I like both. As we discussed earlier, both the caucus system, which involves more involvement of the party professionals, the activists, the people who know the most about politics and who try to compromise and unify various competing interests, and also, as you suggest, a more discussion of issues and candidates in the kitchen, in the living room. It's not just going into a poll and voting and leaving. You've got to make more of a commitment to it, and you've got to test and study and deal with that choice a little bit more seriously. The primaries, and we have our first, we have the Massachusetts primary, of course, coming up in 2 days, following the first New Hampshire primary last week. That gives you more participation, and it gives you a much more open, democratic voting opportunity. But it only takes place in 1 day, and it can be very fast and very superficial. The point is you need both. And in the Iowa and the Arkansas and the Maine caucuses, we saw the great advantages of the caucus system, and now we're moving into the second part of the first phase of the whole nominating process, and we're getting into the primaries where people vote in much larger numbers.
Now, what are the stakes? Depending upon who wins in Massachusetts, how significant is this? Will this really make a swing, besides the fact that everybody says it's going to knock off some of the people at the bottom because they can't sustain their campaigns anymore? Is Massachusetts a key state because it is now a very big urban state as opposed to Iowa or Arkansas? Is this telling something to the people who are running the campaigns, do you think?
Massachusetts is a key state because it is the first large urban industrial state. It is important because before the whole process, the whole calendar moves into the South, it will have a very large influence on who carries momentum into the southern states where the next round, so to speak, is going to be fought out. And Massachusetts is important, consistent with that, because it will determine whether there are only two-man races in both parties, and whether one of those two men is relatively damaged or is being relatively thrust forward with an advantage over his opponent.
But this is a beauty contest in a way, because this has been waged by the media. As you said, the primaries really are more that way. You have to reach large numbers, so you use television. Do you think that what has happened to date really reflects what people want, or the fact that people fall in with, well, he looks like more than he does? The fact that there's been so much money spent in the campaign and that some people can afford to buy lots more time than others.
Well, Massachusetts first is more than a beauty contest because it is selecting delegates for the two-party conventions. Massachusetts has a very interesting system because although there is a primary election, the actual delegates who will be determined by the results of the primary election to go to the conventions on behalf of the respective parties are chosen in caucuses and at meetings of the state committees. So Massachusetts is very privileged in that it has a combined primary caucus convention system. We won't know until after the whole nominating process has been completed as to how reflective it was. But it is a pluralistic system, and as I mentioned before, one of the most encouraging aspects we've seen so far is that there's a lot of participation. Participation is up in both primaries and caucuses over 4 years ago. People seem to be taking the choice very seriously this year. That's one of the reasons why the voting population seems as volatile as it is. It's holding its decision till the last minute. It's studying, it's testing, it's assessing, and that looks to me to be very healthy.
Everybody has talked about the fact that President Carter has not come out and campaigned, that the Iranian issue has kept him from really dealing with local and national issues, and that this has in a way deflected the campaign because people have responded either to talking about the fact that Carter's not doing it. It's been hard to talk about the issues that affect us all, the economy, inflation, energy, and so forth. In what way do you feel that that will change in the future? Are people going to finally get tired of talking about Iran and say, come on, let's get out and hear about how it affects us?
That well may be, but it's doubtful that that change will occur, or it's questionable as to whether that change will occur during the primary system or whether it will only occur after the, or at the time of the nominating conventions and when we start getting into the general election. So what has happened is that the foreign policy events and developments which you mentioned on the Democratic side has become a tremendous boon to President Carter, not only because it gives him a chance to show presidential leadership, but also because it gives him a chance to ask for patriotic support and backing from the American people, and because it puts a real constraint on his opponents in terms of talking openly about these complex and very tricky issues of foreign policy. So whereas Kennedy, for instance, started high up and Carter started really very low at the beginning of the process last fall, the foreign policy issue has really mauled on the Democratic side, given Carter tremendous advantages, pinned his opponents down. What may happen is, as you suggest, it's unlikely that that dynamic will go on indefinitely, and the fact that people are anxious about our position in the world, and the fact that there seems to be no coherent strategy coming from Carter as to how to deal with international interests in the long run. If there is some stability in Afghanistan, if maybe the hostages come back, then some of these other issues, the domestic issues, particularly the economy and inflation, are going to have much more strength, growing strength in the campaign. That may tend to pin Carter down more. It's much less advantageous for him to deal with the issue of inflation than it is with the issue of foreign policy. But that may not happen until after Carter has effectively pinned down the Democratic nomination for himself.
And as far as the Republican candidates are concerned, very quickly, can you say who do you think will come out winners in the Massachusetts primary?
Well, I'd rather not handicap that. It's very much neck and neck right now between Reagan and Bush, as we all know.
Connolly hasn't got a chance in Massachusetts.
No, and Connolly has effectively put himself into South Carolina.
Yes.
Because that's about all he's got. Money has played a very powerful and I think a very dangerous role in this campaign. Connolly has spent $10 million, hasn't got anywhere, and now is borrowing. Jerry Brown may have lost his federal matching and therefore has to now bypass Massachusetts and go into Wisconsin. And Ronald Reagan has spent $11 or $12 million, which gets him dangerously close to the limit that is placed on him of a total of $17 million because he accepted federal matching funds. How he's going to confine the remaining parts of his campaigning for the full nomination on that small amount of money that's left, I don't know. So money is one of the most dominant, one of the most dangerous aspects, one of the most defective aspects of the way that our nominating process is designed, and no one really has got an answer to how to straighten that out yet.
We will have Jonathan Moore come back in a month or so to continue to not necessarily handicap, but help us understand what is happening to us in the primary process. Thank you very much.